A single piece of bread. That was all she had left. No one in that crowded railway carriage paid attention to the exhausted stranger sitting quietly by the window. His coat was plain, his luggage was worn, and there was nothing about him that suggested wealth, influence, or importance. One by one, the passengers looked away, convinced he was simply another forgotten traveler. But one young woman noticed something everyone else missed. Without asking his name, without expecting gratitude, and without knowing who he truly was, she broke her last loaf of bread in half and placed one piece in his hands. What she couldn't possibly imagine was that this quiet stranger had spent his entire life commanding thousands of soldiers, and that the simple choice she was about to make would answer a question he had been asking for years. Stay with me until the end, because what happened after that small act of kindness transformed both of their lives forever. The morning train cut through the English countryside beneath a blanket of pale gray clouds, its iron wheels striking the rails with a steady rhythm that echoed across fields soaked by the night's rain. Inside the third-class carriage, the air carried the mingled scents of damp wool, old leather luggage, coal smoke drifting in through cracked windows, and fresh bread wrapped in linen cloth. Most passengers remained absorbed in their own concerns, carefully avoiding eye contact with strangers. Yet amid that ordinary silence, one small gesture was about to begin a story no one aboard would ever forget. Years later, those who witnessed it would remember neither the weather nor the destination. They would remember only a woman, a stranger, and a single piece of bread. The man seated near the rear of the carriage appeared entirely unremarkable. His dark overcoat had seen years of use, its cuffs slightly worn despite being impeccably clean. A weathered leather satchel rested beside polished boots that hinted at discipline rather than wealth. Silver had begun to overtake the dark hair at his temples, while deep lines around his eyes suggested decades spent making difficult decisions. He carried himself with unusual composure, yet there was an unmistakable exhaustion in his posture, the kind that sleep alone could never cure. No title accompanied him. No medals reflected the dim morning light. To every eye in the carriage, he was merely another aging traveler. Across from him sat a young seamstress whose quiet presence almost disappeared among the crowd. Eirlys Wynfar wore a simple moss-green traveling dress beneath a carefully mended charcoal cloak, its stitching so skillfully repaired that only someone trained with a needle could recognize the countless hours hidden within it. Resting upon her lap was a small wicker basket containing little more than a folded cloth, a sewing kit, and a modest loaf of oat bread that was clearly meant to sustain her throughout the day. When she noticed the stranger's trembling hands linger just a heartbeat too long upon his empty satchel before quietly withdrawing again, she understood something the others never even bothered to see. Before you discover why that single observation would alter both of their lives forever. There is something you need to understand about the place where this journey truly began. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories that reveal the extraordinary power of ordinary people, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Every week we bring stories filled with humanity, justice, and unforgettable moments. Now, let's go back to where it all truly began. Ashcombe rested between gentle hills and winding streams in northern England, appearing at first glance like the very image of peace. Stone cottages lined narrow streets polished smooth by generations of footsteps, their chimneys releasing ribbons of smoke that drifted lazily into the cool morning air. Church bells marked each passing hour, merchants greeted familiar customers by surname, and polished brass signs hung proudly above every respectable establishment. Visitors often admired the town's charm, believing they had discovered a community built upon honor and tradition. Few remained long enough to notice the invisible rules governing every smile exchanged along its streets. In Ashcombe, lineage opened doors that kindness never could. Families whose names appeared in church records for centuries enjoyed unquestioned respect, regardless of their conduct, while those born without influence labored endlessly for even the smallest measure of acceptance. Invitations to charity dinners, business partnerships, and public celebrations depended less upon integrity than upon ancestry. Reputation passed from parent to child, like inherited property, and once society placed someone near the bottom of its invisible hierarchy, climbing upward became nearly impossible. People spoke often of virtue, yet too frequently confused wealth with wisdom and status with goodness. Eirlys had learned these lessons long before reaching adulthood. Her late father had worked honestly as a village bookbinder whose craftsmanship earned admiration, but never prosperity, while her mother had spent her life teaching that dignity could survive poverty if one refused to surrender compassion. After losing both parents within a handful of difficult years, Eirlys inherited little beyond their tiny cottage, worn furniture, and values that could neither be sold nor stolen. Many neighbors pitied her circumstances, but very few truly knew her. Fewer still understood why she continued helping strangers despite receiving almost nothing in return. The answer lay hidden within experiences that had quietly shaped the woman she would become. Every morning before sunrise, while much of Ashcombe still slept beneath fading stars, Eirlys lit a small oil lamp beside the narrow window of her workshop. The warm golden glow illuminated shelves, neatly arranged with folded fabrics, wooden spools of thread, carefully sharpened shears, and patterns worn smooth through years of patient use. The gentle clicking of her needle became the first sound greeting each new day, accompanied by the comforting aroma of beeswax candles and freshly brewed black tea. Though her earnings remained modest, every stitch reflected extraordinary precision, as though each garment deserved the same care regardless of who would eventually wear it. Customers often underestimated her because of her quiet demeanor. Wealthy ladies occasionally assumed that silence signified weakness, while prosperous gentlemen rarely remembered her name after collecting their tailored coats. Yet behind that reserved smile lived remarkable resilience. Whenever widows arrived carrying garments too damaged to repair properly, Eirlys quietly reduced her price without mentioning it. If an elderly laborer lacked enough coins to mend a winter coat before the first frost, she somehow found spare fabric left over from other commissions. She never announced these acts of generosity. She simply believed that kindness diminished the weight everyone secretly carried. Her closest acquaintance was an elderly widow named Mrs. Isolde Merrow, who frequently insisted that goodness eventually found its way home, even if years passed before anyone noticed. Eirlys would always smile politely at the old woman's optimism, though she privately doubted such promises. Experience had taught her that life rarely rewarded decent people quickly, if at all. Still, abandoning compassion would have meant betraying everything her parents had entrusted to her. She could not know that before this journey ended, someone sitting only a few feet away would measure her entire character, not by grand achievements, but by the smallest decision she believed no one important would ever witness. For more than 30 years, General Alaric Thorne had commanded soldiers across distant battlefields where fog, fear, and responsibility often arrived together before sunrise. His name appeared in military reports studied throughout the kingdom, while portraits displayed inside government buildings depicted a decorated officer whose decisions had altered the course of campaigns. Yet every honor he had received seemed strangely distant whenever he removed the uniform. Titles commanded obedience, medals attracted admiration. Neither could reveal whether respect remained once those symbols disappeared. That realization had lingered in his thoughts for months before this journey began. Rather than traveling inside a private carriage reserved for officers of his standing, Alaric purchased an ordinary third-class ticket under a simple family name known only to a trusted secretary. He dressed plainly, carried no insignia, and deliberately concealed every trace of authority. His purpose extended far beyond curiosity. Retirement approached sooner than most believed, and before stepping away from public service, he wished to answer one final question that no military report could ever resolve. What kind of people still chose kindness when they believed absolutely nothing could be gained from it? The previous evening had already tested that question. An innkeeper had dismissed him with little courtesy after assuming he lacked sufficient means, while several travelers ignored his requests for directions, despite passing within arm's reach. None of these encounters troubled him deeply. They merely confirmed suspicions he had quietly carried for years. But as the train continued through the mist-covered countryside, and he watched the young seamstress across from him notice what every other passenger overlooked, Alaric sensed that this journey was beginning to lead somewhere entirely unexpected. The train slowed as it rounded a broad curve overlooking rain-darkened fields, where sheep grazed beneath ancient oak trees bending gently in the wind. Inside the carriage, conversations rose and fell like distant waves, interrupted only by the occasional hiss of escaping steam. Eirlys carefully unfolded the linen cloth, protecting her modest breakfast. The oat bread remained slightly warm, carrying the comforting aroma of fresh grain baked only hours before. She paused before taking the first bite, her eyes drifting almost instinctively toward the quiet gentleman opposite her. His attention remained fixed upon the passing landscape, yet the faint tightening of his jaw betrayed a hunger he had made every effort to conceal. Without hesitation or ceremony, she broke the loaf precisely in half. There was no dramatic speech, no attempt to embarrass him with charity, and no expectation of gratitude. She simply extended one portion across the narrow space, separating them with the same calm expression she might have offered it to an old friend. For a brief moment, the carriage seemed to fall completely silent. Several nearby passengers glanced toward them with visible surprise, puzzled that anyone would willingly share food with an unfamiliar traveler whose appearance suggested no promise of repayment. The stranger hesitated only long enough to understand the significance of what she had done before quietly accepting the bread with sincere appreciation. Neither of them realized they had already been observed by another pair of watchful eyes farther down the carriage. Within the next hour, a man whose influence reached nearly every corner of Ashcombe would board the train, carrying with him polished manners, impeccable clothing, and a heart consumed by quiet arrogance. His arrival would test every conviction Eirlys possessed, and give General Alaric Thorne the answer he had spent months searching for. At this point, it may seem as though this is simply the story of two strangers sharing a train ride. But someone dangerous is about to enter that carriage. And before this journey is over, every person aboard will wish they had paid closer attention to the quiet man sitting beside Eirlys. The bread was still warm when General Alaric accepted it with both hands, almost ceremonially. For a brief instant, he simply looked at it, not because the offering was insignificant, but because it had been many years since someone had given him something without first recognizing his rank. He had been welcomed into grand estates, honored at royal banquets, applauded before thousands of soldiers, yet every gesture had been accompanied by protocol, expectation, or obligation. This piece of humble oat bread, wrapped only in genuine kindness, carried more sincerity than countless formal receptions he had attended throughout his career. As he took his first bite, the subtle sweetness of freshly milled grain mixed with the smoky scent of coal drifting through the carriage, awakening memories he had not visited in decades. Eirlys returned her attention to the passing countryside, as though nothing remarkable had happened. She neither watched him eat, nor waited for gratitude. To her, kindness lost much of its meaning the moment it expected acknowledgement. Outside, hedgerows blurred beneath the persistent drizzle, while distant farmhouses disappeared behind curtains of mist. Inside the carriage, however, curiosity had quietly begun to spread. Several passengers exchanged discreet glances. One elderly gentleman lowered his newspaper just enough to observe the unlikely pair. A pair of elegantly dressed sisters whispered behind lace gloves, unable to understand why a respectable young woman would willingly share her only meal with someone who appeared to possess neither wealth nor influence. Alaric studied her carefully, without making it obvious. During military campaigns, he had learned that a person's smallest habits often revealed more than grand speeches ever could. The way she folded the linen cloth before placing it back inside her basket, the patience with which she waited for elderly passengers to move before adjusting her own seat, the calm expression that never sought approval from anyone around her. All of it spoke of character formed quietly over many years. There was no performance in her generosity, no audience she hoped to impress. She believed no one important was watching. That quiet generosity certainly caught the general's attention, but years of experience had taught him that a single act rarely revealed the whole truth about a person. Genuine character only appeared when kindness became inconvenient, when dignity was tested, and when there was every reason to choose differently. For the first time since beginning his journey, he wondered whether this young seamstress might be exactly the person he had been searching for, or whether the next few hours would prove him wrong. As the train continued northward, a young railway porter entered the carriage carrying a dented copper kettle filled with hot tea. His uniform was clean, but visibly worn, and exhaustion clung to his face despite his polite smile. He announced the refreshments in a courteous voice, though everyone aboard knew they were available only for passengers able to pay. One by one, orders were placed. Fine porcelain cups were filled, coins exchanged hands, and the rich aroma of black tea soon drifted through the compartment. The porter eventually reached Eirlys, who instinctively searched the small purse tucked inside her basket, before quietly realizing she no longer possessed enough money for even a single cup. She thanked the young man with such genuine warmth that he almost apologized for circumstances beyond his control. Before he could move on, however, Eirlys noticed something unexpected. His hands trembled ever so slightly as he balanced the kettle, and the faint shadows beneath his eyes revealed someone who had likely begun working long before dawn. She asked softly whether he had managed to eat breakfast. Caught completely off guard, the porter admitted with an embarrassed smile that the morning had been unusually busy. Without hesitation, Eirlys reached into her basket once more and removed the remaining portion of her bread, the only food she had left for the entire journey. The young porter refused at first, insisting he could not possibly accept it from a paying passenger. Yet she simply smiled and insisted that she had already eaten enough. It was a gentle lie, one spoken not to deceive, but to preserve another person's dignity. Finally accepting the bread, the porter thanked her with visible emotion before continuing through the carriage. Although she smiled warmly, the dull ache of hunger stayed with her for the remainder of the journey. She never mentioned it to anyone. Several wealthy travelers watched the exchange unfold without offering so much as a biscuit from their overflowing hampers. Alaric observed every detail in complete silence. For a brief moment, Alaric questioned whether this kindness came naturally to her, or whether it had simply been inspired by the circumstances of the journey. Experience had taught him never to judge a soul too quickly. Some people were generous when life was comfortable. Far fewer remained generous when kindness came at a personal cost. He continued watching, convinced that the journey itself would reveal the answer. The carriage doors opened sharply at the next station, allowing a rush of cold air to sweep through the compartment. Raindrops clung to polished boots as new passengers stepped aboard, bringing with them the scent of expensive cologne, freshly pressed wool, and damp umbrellas. At the center of the group walked a tall gentleman whose tailored navy overcoat fit with mathematical precision. A silver-topped cane rested lightly in one gloved hand, not because he required support, but because it completed the image he carefully cultivated. His name was Caedmon Harrow, one of Ashcombe's most influential merchants, admired publicly for his charitable donations and impeccable manners. The instant his eyes settled upon Eirlys, an almost invisible smile crossed his face. It was the expression of a man who believed he had discovered an opportunity for amusement. Removing his gloves with theatrical calm, he greeted several prosperous acquaintances before finally acknowledging the seamstress with exaggerated courtesy. "Miss Wynfar," he said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I trust your remarkable generosity has not yet reduced you to complete starvation." A ripple of restrained laughter spread through the compartment. To anyone unfamiliar with the two of them, the remark sounded playful. Only Eirlys recognized the carefully concealed contempt beneath every polished word. She responded with the same quiet dignity she offered everyone else. "Good morning, Mr. Harrow. I hope your journey is comfortable." There was no bitterness in her voice, no attempt to embarrass him in return. That restraint irritated Caedmon more than open defiance ever could. He had spent years discovering that cruelty disguised as wit rarely attracted criticism from polite society. People laughed because everyone else laughed. They remained silent because challenging influential men often carried consequences. General Alaric watched the exchange with increasing interest. The battlefield had taught him that arrogance seldom revealed itself through shouting. Far more dangerous were those who wounded others while wearing a perfectly pleasant smile. For several miles, conversation drifted toward ordinary matters. Harvest forecasts, railway schedules, textile prices, and rumors circulating through nearby counties filled the carriage with polite but forgettable discussion. Caedmon entertained his companions effortlessly, demonstrating the refined charm that had earned him admiration throughout Ashcombe. Every laugh appeared perfectly timed, every compliment carefully measured. To most observers, he seemed the very definition of a respectable gentleman. Yet each time he glanced toward Eirlys, there remained a subtle satisfaction in his eyes, as though reminding her of a place he believed she should never rise above. An elderly woman seated beside the window eventually asked Eirlys whether she had family waiting for her in York. The question carried no malice, only gentle curiosity. After a thoughtful pause, Eirlys answered honestly. She explained that both of her parents had passed away several years earlier, and that she now traveled alone whenever work required it. She spoke fondly of her father's patience as a craftsman, and her mother's unwavering belief that kindness represented the only wealth no one could ever steal. Her voice remained steady throughout the recollection, though a softness entered her expression whenever she mentioned home. She never sought sympathy. She simply answered the question she had been asked. The carriage grew noticeably quieter. Even Caedmon withheld his next sarcastic remark for a moment longer than usual. Alaric listened intently, recognizing something profoundly familiar beneath her words. He had commanded thousands of soldiers, many of whom came from humble families that possessed little beyond honor and perseverance. Those men had often displayed greater courage than officers born into privilege. Watching Eirlys speak with such quiet conviction reminded him that the strongest foundations of character were almost always laid far from grand houses and public recognition. Still, one question remained unanswered in his mind, and before the journey ended, he intended to ask it. The rain had finally begun to ease. allowing pale shafts of sunlight to filter through the clouds and illuminate the countryside in soft, silver light. Water droplets clung to the train windows like tiny crystals, distorting distant hills into blurred watercolor landscapes. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels created a strangely peaceful backdrop as most passengers settled into comfortable silence. Taking advantage of the calm, Alaric turned slightly toward Eirlys, his voice measured and almost conversational. "May I ask you something?" he began gently. She nodded without hesitation. "You've shared your breakfast with a stranger and given the rest to a railway porter you'll likely never see again. Forgive my curiosity, but why?" It was a simple question, delivered without judgment. Yet it carried the weight of years spent observing people under extraordinary circumstances. Alaric had seen men risk their lives for glory, for loyalty, for fear, even for ambition. Acts performed with absolutely nothing to gain had become increasingly rare. He watched her carefully, not searching for the correct answer, but for an honest one. Eirlys looked out the window for a brief moment before speaking. "Because hunger doesn't ask whether someone deserves help," she said quietly. "It simply exists. If I have enough to ease it, even a little, then I don't think it's mine alone anymore." Her words contained neither philosophy nor performance. They emerged naturally, as though she had never considered living any other way. Even after hearing her answer, Alaric resisted drawing conclusions. Words could be sincere, but they could also be beautifully rehearsed. What mattered most was whether her actions would continue matching her convictions when the journey became more difficult. Alaric lowered his eyes for a moment, reflecting upon everything he had witnessed since boarding the train. Before he could respond, however, the compartment door opened once again. Caedmon Harrow rose from his seat and began walking directly toward them with an expression that suggested the most difficult part of the journey was only beginning. If this story has captured your attention so far, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. It helps the channel continue bringing powerful stories like this one, and you won't miss the next unforgettable journey. Now, let's see how quickly appearances begin to deceive everyone inside that carriage. Caedmon stopped beside their seats with the effortless confidence of a man accustomed to commanding every room he entered. The polished silver handle of his cane caught the afternoon light as he removed his gloves, finger by finger, smiling pleasantly enough that an outsider might have mistaken him for an old family friend. His tailored overcoat carried the faint fragrance of cedar and expensive cologne, while the gold watch chain stretched neatly across his waistcoat reflected the prosperity he so carefully displayed. Every detail of his appearance had been chosen to communicate success before he ever spoke a single word. "My dear Miss Wynfar," he said warmly, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I do hope your business is finally improving. It would be tragic if your remarkable talent continued to be appreciated only by those unable to pay for it." Several travelers chuckled politely. To them, the remark sounded almost complimentary. Only Eirlys recognized the familiar cruelty hidden beneath its elegant surface. Caedmon had perfected this style of humiliation over many years. He never shouted, he never insulted anyone directly. Instead, he wrapped contempt inside polished language until bystanders questioned whether any offense had occurred at all. Alaric remained silent, though his attention sharpened immediately. During his years in command, he had encountered officers whose greatest weapon was neither intelligence nor courage, but manipulation. They understood that power became most dangerous when disguised as refinement. Watching Caedmon speak, he recognized that same calculated precision. The merchant wanted admiration from the crowd, dominance over his target, and complete freedom from accountability, all at the same time. Most disturbing of all was how naturally everyone around him seemed willing to grant exactly that. Caedmon leaned lightly upon his cane as though continuing an innocent conversation. "I recently passed your little workshop," he remarked casually. "Such admirable determination. Most people would have accepted long ago that some businesses simply are not destined for success." His smile never faded. Neither did the approving murmurs among the wealthier passengers, many of whom viewed his observations as harmless wit. They admired confidence, especially when wrapped in impeccable manners. Few possessed enough discernment to recognize humiliation delivered with perfect etiquette. Eirlys folded her hands calmly atop her basket before answering. "The workshop provides exactly what I need, Mr. Harrow. I'm grateful for every customer who trusts my work." Her voice remained steady, carrying neither resentment nor defensiveness. She refused to apologize for living modestly, yet she also refused to answer arrogance with arrogance. That balance required remarkable discipline. It would have been easier to defend herself, easier to expose his constant mockery, easier to demand fairness. Instead, she chose dignity, understanding that preserving one's character often required greater strength than winning an argument. The restraint unsettled Caedmon more than open resistance would have. He enjoyed provoking emotional reactions because anger could always be portrayed as instability. Calmness denied him that advantage. As he searched for another opportunity to diminish her before the growing audience, Alaric quietly observed every exchange. His expression remained unreadable, but behind those composed eyes, he was already measuring not only the merchant's character, but also the reactions of every passenger who chose laughter over courage. A leader, he believed, was never judged solely by enemies. He was judged equally by those who witnessed injustice and remained comfortably silent. What happens next will expose far more than one man's arrogance. A single decision to remain silent will reveal everyone's true character. And the quiet stranger has already begun to see exactly who each person really is. Keep watching, because the most important revelation is still ahead. Several passengers expected the older gentleman seated across from Eirlys to speak. His posture suggested confidence. His gaze never wandered, and there was something quietly authoritative about the way he occupied even the simplest wooden seat. Yet he offered no interruption. He neither defended the seamstress nor challenged the merchant. Instead, he continued listening with almost unsettling patience. To anyone watching, his silence could easily have been mistaken for indifference. Only Alaric himself understood how difficult that silence truly was. Years earlier, while serving on distant battlefields, he had learned that intervening too early often prevented hidden truths from revealing themselves. A dishonest witness usually exposed far more than any interrogation could uncover. A cruel man, given enough confidence, eventually displayed the full extent of his own nature. If Alaric revealed his authority now, Caedmon would immediately transform into the respectful gentleman admired throughout Ashcombe. The performance would begin before the truth fully emerged. So the general waited, forcing himself to endure each carefully disguised insult, believing that patience would ultimately protect far more people than outrage ever could. Across the carriage, an elderly widow quietly followed every word. Miss Beatrice Ashcroft had spent nearly 70 years observing human behavior, and experience had taught her that silence itself often carried meaning. She noticed the older traveler's posture, the discipline with which he listened, and the strange habit of instinctively scanning every doorway whenever the train stopped. These were not the mannerisms of an ordinary civilian. She said nothing, yet curiosity began settling into her thoughts. Something about this quiet stranger refused to fit the story everyone else believed they were witnessing. As the train crossed an old stone bridge, sunlight finally broke through the clouds, bathing the countryside in warm golden light. Rivers shimmered beneath the arches while flocks of birds lifted gracefully from rain-soaked meadows. Inside the carriage, however, the atmosphere remained noticeably colder. Caedmon had succeeded in entertaining much of his audience, and although no one openly joined his mockery anymore, almost no one challenged it either. The silence surrounding Eirlys carried its own quiet loneliness. A nervous young mother struggled nearby with several parcels that threatened to slide from the overhead rack every time the train swayed. Before anyone else reacted, Eirlys immediately stood, carefully securing the packages with a spare length of ribbon from her sewing basket. She smiled reassuringly at the woman, adjusted the loose blanket covering the sleeping infant, and returned to her own seat without waiting for thanks. The gesture lasted less than a minute. Most passengers barely noticed it. Alaric noticed every second. He found himself reflecting upon something an old military chaplain had once told him many years before. True character is measured not by how someone behaves after being praised, but by how they behave immediately after being wounded. Eirlys had just endured public humiliation, yet the very next opportunity she encountered was met with generosity rather than resentment. There was no calculation behind her actions. She had not become kind because life had treated her kindly. She had remained kind despite everything life had placed before her. That distinction, Alaric realized, made all the difference. If you're enjoying this story, this is the perfect moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It may seem like a small gesture, but it makes a tremendous difference and helps us continue sharing stories that stay with you long after they're over. Now the journey is about to take an unexpected turn. Mrs. Beatrice Ashcroft adjusted her spectacles as she continued observing the quiet gentleman. Her late husband had served as a military physician decades earlier, and although many years had passed since his death, she still remembered the unmistakable habits that long service instilled in experienced officers. They instinctively sat facing entrances. Their hands remained relaxed but always ready. Their eyes assessed rooms before conversations. Those habits rarely disappeared, no matter how ordinary the clothing. The stranger's speech also intrigued her. His accent carried traces of elite military academies, softened by years spent commanding men from every corner of the kingdom. When he thanked Eirlys for the bread, he had done so with remarkable precision, choosing words carefully without sounding rehearsed. Even his posture while reading the newspaper betrayed someone accustomed to giving orders rather than receiving them. None of these details proved anything individually. Together, however, they formed a puzzle Mrs. Ashcroft found impossible to ignore. She glanced discreetly toward the worn leather satchel resting beside him. It was plain enough to escape notice, yet its buckles had clearly been crafted by a military supplier rather than an ordinary leather worker. Tiny scratches near the brass fittings suggested years of disciplined use rather than careless travel. The widow smiled faintly to herself. Whatever this gentleman's true identity might be, she had become increasingly certain of one thing. He was not simply an aging traveler on his way north, and before the day ended, that suspicion would receive its first undeniable confirmation. The train slowed as it approached the small station of Bramble Heath, a quiet stop surrounded by rain-darkened stone platforms and neatly trimmed hedges glistening beneath the afternoon sun. Porters hurried alongside the carriages, pushing wooden carts piled high with trunks, while the shrill whistle of the locomotive echoed across the valley. Several passengers rose from their seats to stretch their legs, filling the compartment with the rustling of coats, the scraping of boots against the wooden floor, and the muffled murmur of conversations drifting through the open doors. As Alaric stood to retrieve a folded timetable from his satchel, something slipped unnoticed from the inner pocket of his overcoat. It landed softly beneath the edge of the wooden bench, producing little more than the faintest metallic sound against the floorboards. No one appeared to notice, or so it seemed. As Mrs. Ashcroft quietly bent to retrieve the object, Caedmon's eyes briefly wandered toward the floor after catching the faint metallic sound. For one tense heartbeat, she feared he had seen it as well. Fortunately, another passenger stepped into the aisle at that exact moment, blocking his view completely. Only then did she carefully conceal the medallion inside her handkerchief. When the general stepped briefly onto the platform for fresh air, she finally examined what she had recovered. It was surprisingly heavy, fashioned from aged silver rather than polished decoration. At its center rested a finely engraved crest surrounded by laurel leaves, accompanied by a Latin motto she had seen only once before in her entire life. The elderly widow felt her heartbeat quicken. Years earlier, while visiting her husband's regiment during a military ceremony in London, she had seen that exact insignia displayed upon the ceremonial standard of one of the kingdom's oldest military commands. It belonged neither to an ordinary officer nor to a retired veteran. It was reserved exclusively for the commanding general of the Northern Army. She quickly wrapped the medallion inside her handkerchief before anyone else noticed, understanding immediately that the stranger had concealed his identity with extraordinary care. The question now was no longer whether he held an important position. The real mystery was why a man of such stature had chosen to travel among ordinary citizens without revealing who he truly was. One small object has just fallen onto the carriage floor. No one realizes its importance yet. But within minutes, that forgotten medallion will completely change the direction of this story and reveal why the quiet traveler has been watching everything so carefully. When Alaric returned to his seat, nothing in his expression suggested concern. He resumed his place quietly, thanking a porter who had wiped rainwater from the carriage steps before the journey continued. Only after several minutes did his hand instinctively reach towards the inside pocket of his coat. For the briefest instant, his fingers paused. The medallion was gone. His eyes moved calmly through the compartment, not with panic, but with the disciplined awareness of someone trained never to betray alarm. If another passenger had found it, the anonymity he had protected so carefully could disappear in moments. Mrs. Ashcroft watched him from across the aisle, recognizing the almost imperceptible shift in his demeanor. Waiting until no one seemed to be paying attention, she leaned forward slightly. "Sir," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "I believe this belongs to you." Hidden beneath the folds of her handkerchief rested the silver medallion. Alaric accepted it with composed gratitude, though the surprise in his eyes lasted just long enough for the widow to confirm everything she had suspected. She offered no dramatic reaction, no astonished gasp, no public announcement. Instead, she simply smiled with quiet respect. "You needn't worry," she murmured softly. "Some identities deserve privacy." Their eyes met for only a moment before she returned to her seat, as though nothing unusual had happened. Alaric inclined his head in silent appreciation. Few people possessed both the perception to recognize the emblem and the wisdom to keep such knowledge to themselves. From that instant forward, Mrs. Ashcroft became more than an observer. She became the sole witness who understood the truth hidden beneath the general's ordinary appearance. Meanwhile, only a few rows away, Caedmon Harrow remained blissfully unaware that he had spent the last hour mocking one of the highest-ranking military officers in the kingdom. Confident that the carriage had accepted his version of events, Caedmon settled comfortably into his upholstered seat and resumed entertaining the passengers gathered around him. Stories of profitable business ventures, charitable donations, and influential acquaintances flowed effortlessly from his lips. Every anecdote painted him as a man admired by judges, respected by politicians, and welcomed into the finest drawing rooms throughout the county. The listeners nodded with admiration, some clearly hoping to earn his favor simply by laughing at the appropriate moments. Kedman mistook their politeness for genuine respect, never realizing how often wealth could purchase agreement without ever earning admiration. His attention soon returned to Eirlys. "Tell me, Miss Wynfar," he said with practiced friendliness, "have you finally accepted that certain dreams remain unrealistic?" He paused deliberately, allowing the silence to sharpen the insult. A talented seamstress is still only a seamstress. One must learn to appreciate one's proper place. The words were delivered so smoothly that several passengers smiled without fully considering their meaning. To Kedman, this was victory. He believed he had reminded her, once again, of the invisible boundaries society expected her never to cross. Eirlys looked towards the countryside beyond the rain-speckled glass before answering. "I have never believed that honest work places anyone beneath another person." Her reply came gently, without accusation. A title may describe what someone does. It does not decide who someone is. The simplicity of her words lingered in the carriage long after she finished speaking. Even those who had laughed earlier now found themselves unusually quiet. Alaric felt an almost imperceptible smile touch the corner of his mouth. Without realizing it, Eirlys had just expressed the very conviction that had inspired his entire journey. By the time the train entered the broad valley leading toward York, the weather had changed once more. Thin ribbons of mist drifted across green meadows, where stone fences divided the landscape into perfect geometric patterns. The fading afternoon sun filtered through the haze, casting everything in soft shades of silver and gold. Inside the carriage, conversation gradually subsided as travelers sensed the journey nearing its end. Luggage was gathered. Hats were adjusted. Windows fogged lightly with warm breath meeting cool glass. Taking advantage of the peaceful moment, Alaric turned toward Eirlys again. His voice remained as calm as it had throughout the day, yet there was now unmistakable sincerity behind every word. "May I ask you one final question?" She smiled politely and nodded. "Have you never grown tired?" he asked. "Tired of offering kindness to people who rarely return it? Tired of being underestimated? Tired of living in a world where generosity often seems invisible?" The question did not sound philosophical. It sounded deeply personal, as though it had accompanied him for many years. Eirlys considered the question carefully before answering. "Of course I've grown tired," she admitted with quiet honesty. "There are evenings when loneliness feels heavier than the work itself. There are mornings when disappointment arrives before breakfast. But becoming bitter would only allow those who caused the hurt to shape the person I become. I'd rather carry hope than resentment, even when hope feels heavier." Her words settled over the carriage with remarkable stillness. Mrs. Ashcroft lowered her gaze thoughtfully. Even several strangers who had never spoken to Eirlys found themselves reflecting upon her answer. Alaric, however, understood that he had just heard something far more valuable than simple optimism. For several moments, Alaric said nothing at all. Outside, the locomotive released a long plume of white steam that disappeared into the cool evening sky, while distant church bells floated faintly across the countryside. The rhythmic sound of the wheels beneath the carriage seemed almost to fade as he replayed every encounter of the journey in his mind. The shared bread, the kindness toward the porter, the quiet patience in the face of humiliation, the refusal to answer cruelty with cruelty. None of those moments had been extraordinary on their own. Together, however, they revealed a character stronger than any military decoration he had ever awarded. He remembered countless ceremonies held after difficult campaigns, where bravery had been recognized with polished medals before cheering crowds. Those honors were deserved, yet many acts of courage never appeared in official reports. A nurse who stayed awake through freezing nights beside wounded soldiers, a stable boy who carried messages under enemy fire without ever receiving public acknowledgement. A village woman who fed hungry strangers simply because she believed they deserved to eat. History often celebrated dramatic heroism while overlooking quiet goodness. Sitting across from Eirlys, Alaric realized he had encountered another form of courage altogether. The courage to remain compassionate in a world that offered little encouragement to do so. He finally met her eyes with an expression warmer than at any previous moment during the journey. "Thank you," he said simply. She looked slightly puzzled. "For the bread?" she asked with a gentle smile. Alaric shook his head almost imperceptibly. "For answering a question I've been asking for a very long time." Before Eirlys could ask what he meant, the train whistle echoed loudly through the evening air as the great station of York came into view. Neither she nor anyone else in the carriage had the slightest idea that within the next few minutes, the quiet stranger beside her would step onto the platform, and the entire station would come to attention. The train released one final hiss of steam as it rolled beneath the vast iron canopy of York Station. Evening sunlight filtered through the glass roof, casting long golden beams across the crowded platforms, where porters hurried between towering stacks of luggage and passengers embraced waiting relatives. The scent of hot coal, polished brass, damp stone, and freshly baked pastries drifting from the station cafe blended into the unmistakable atmosphere of one of England's busiest railway terminals. It seemed like the conclusion of an ordinary journey, until an unusual silence began spreading across Platform 3. Long before the carriage doors opened completely, a formation of uniformed soldiers appeared from the far end of the platform. Their polished boots struck the stone in perfect rhythm as they advanced with disciplined precision. Behind them walked several senior officers wearing ceremonial uniforms adorned with ribbons and decorations that shimmered beneath the fading afternoon light. Railway employees immediately stepped aside. Conversations faded. Curious travelers paused in the middle of the platform, wondering which distinguished guest had inspired such an extraordinary reception. Even Caedmon Harrow leaned towards the window with growing curiosity, convinced that someone of great importance was about to arrive. The carriage door swung open, and for several seconds no one moved. Then the quiet gentleman in the worn overcoat calmly stepped onto the platform carrying nothing more than his weathered leather satchel. The commanding officer standing nearest to the train immediately straightened his posture, raised his hand in a flawless salute, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the station. "Welcome, General Alaric Thorne. The Northern Command has been awaiting your arrival." A leather suitcase slipped from one passenger's hands and struck the platform with a loud thud. One of the elegantly dressed sisters covered her mouth in disbelief. The young railway porter froze where he stood, still remembering the bread Eirlys had shared with him earlier that day. Even the station attendants exchanged astonished glances as whispers spread rapidly through the platform. Every conversation ceased instantly. Inside the carriage, faces turned toward the doorway in stunned disbelief. Eirlys remained motionless, while Caedmon's confident smile disappeared so completely that it seemed never to have existed. The transformation of the platform occurred almost instantly. Soldiers who only moments earlier had appeared to be waiting in quiet formation now stood at rigid attention, every movement synchronized with remarkable precision. Senior officers stepped forward one after another to greet Alaric with unmistakable respect, while station officials bowed their heads courteously before introducing themselves. None of the ceremony felt theatrical. It carried the quiet gravity reserved for a man whose decisions had shaped the lives of thousands. Yet through it all, Alaric remained exactly as he had been throughout the journey. Calm, composed, and almost uncomfortable with excessive attention. Passengers slowly began leaving the carriage, many casting embarrassed glances toward the general before lowering their eyes. The elegantly dressed sisters, who had whispered behind lace gloves, now struggled to remember whether they had laughed during Caedmon's remarks. The elderly gentleman folded his newspaper with obvious discomfort, silently replaying every moment he had witnessed without speaking. Even the young railway porter, who had accepted Eirlys's bread, stared in amazement, only now realizing that the quiet stranger he had served tea beside commanded one of the kingdom's most respected military forces. No announcement from the platform could erase what had already happened inside that carriage. Caedmon remained frozen near the doorway, his carefully constructed confidence collapsing beneath the weight of sudden realization. Every sarcastic remark, every polished insult, every condescending smile replayed mercilessly inside his mind. He had believed himself the most influential man present. Now he understood that he had spent the afternoon publicly belittling someone whose reputation extended far beyond wealth or commerce. Worse still, he realized that the general had witnessed every moment without revealing his identity. The realization settled over him like cold rain. For the first time in many years, Caedmon Harrow found himself completely uncertain of what to say. Everyone now knows who the stranger really is, but the biggest surprise isn't his title. The general has not yet revealed why he chose to travel in secret, and when he finally explains his reason, one person's life will change forever. Don't leave now. The most emotional part of this story is still to come. No one rushed to fill the silence. It lingered across the platform with remarkable weight, broken only by the distant whistle of another locomotive arriving on a neighboring track. Travelers who moments earlier had admired Caedmon's wit now avoided meeting one another's eyes. The memory of their laughter suddenly felt far less amusing. They had judged a stranger by his coat, measured another by her profession, and mistaken arrogance for refinement. Without anyone saying so aloud, every person present understood that the afternoon had become an uncomfortable lesson in appearances. One by one, several passengers quietly approached General Thorne, offering awkward apologies for failing to recognize him. Alaric received each apology with polite courtesy, but never encouraged the conversation. Recognition had never been the purpose of his journey. If anything, these sudden displays of respect confirmed exactly what he had feared before boarding the train. The same people who had ignored him hours earlier now hurried to earn his approval, not because his character had changed, but because his title had become known. Their behavior saddened him far more than it offended him. Standing several steps away, Eirlys watched the unfolding scene with quiet astonishment. She had shared bread with him, spoken honestly to him, and answered every question without the slightest awareness of who he truly was. Yet even after learning that he was one of the kingdom's most decorated military leaders, nothing inside her seemed to change. She neither rushed forward nor retreated in embarrassment. She simply smiled with the same warmth she had shown him inside the train. Alaric noticed that immediately. While nearly everyone else had altered their behavior the moment they discovered his identity, one person remained exactly the same. Before leaving the platform, Mrs. Beatrice Ashcroft quietly approached the general. "I believe our little secret can finally rest," she said with a gentle smile. Alaric inclined his head gratefully. "You guarded my identity better than many officers would have." The elderly widow chuckled softly before disappearing into the evening crowd, content that she had witnessed something worth remembering for the rest of her life. As the crowd gradually dispersed, Alaric excused himself from the welcoming officers and walked back towards the passengers who were still gathering their belongings. His polished boots echoed softly across the stone platform. Yet there was nothing intimidating in his approach. He stopped before Eirlys, removing his gloves exactly as he had done earlier inside the carriage. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The station bustled around them, but it felt as though the noise had drifted into the distance. "I suppose," Eirlys said with a gentle smile, "I should begin calling you General now." A trace of amusement touched Alaric's face. "You may," he replied, "but I'd rather you didn't if you're only doing so because of what happened here." She looked at him thoughtfully before answering. "You're still the gentleman who accepted half a loaf of bread without making me feel embarrassed for offering it." Her words carried no flattery, they were simply true. She had treated him with dignity when she believed he was an ordinary traveler, and she saw no reason to behave differently now. For the first time that day, Alaric laughed softly. It was neither loud nor formal, but genuine enough that several nearby officers glanced toward him with mild surprise. Few had ever seen their commanding general laugh so freely in public. At that moment he realized that the greatest distinction between Eirlys and nearly everyone else around them was astonishingly simple. She responded to people according to their humanity, never according to their status. It was the quality he had searched for across countless cities and social circles, and somehow he had found it inside the most ordinary railway carriage imaginable. The commanding officers respectfully stepped back, sensing that the conversation held personal importance. Alaric looked briefly toward the rows of gleaming medals displayed upon the uniforms surrounding him, before returning his attention to Eirlys. "Do you know why I traveled without revealing my name?" he asked. She shook her head quietly. "Because I needed to remember something I feared this country was beginning to forget." He paused, watching the evening sunlight reflect across the polished brass buttons of the soldiers standing nearby. For years, people have saluted the uniform before looking at the man wearing it. They have praised titles before examining character. They have offered kindness only after discovering someone possesses influence. I wondered whether genuine compassion still existed when there was absolutely nothing to gain from it. His voice remained calm, yet every officer listening understood that the words carried far greater significance than an ordinary conversation. This was not merely the reflection of a military commander. It was the confession of a man deeply concerned about the moral direction of the society he had spent his life defending. Alaric looked directly at Eirlys. "You answered that question before you knew it had even been asked." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The medals upon his uniform, the honors surrounding him, the ceremonial greetings offered throughout the station, all of it suddenly seemed secondary. None of those distinctions had revealed who he truly was. Neither had they revealed who Eirlys was. Only a simple act of kindness between strangers had accomplished that. And in that realization, the general discovered a truth that no decoration, no promotion, and no public ceremony could ever teach. Unable to endure the crushing silence any longer, Cadman hurried toward General Thorne before the welcoming ceremony could continue. "General, if I have caused offense, I sincerely ask your forgiveness," he said, forcing a smile that no longer reached his eyes. Alaric looked at him calmly before answering in a voice barely above a whisper. "You have already given me exactly what I came here to discover. There is nothing more either of us needs to say." Cadman slowly lowered his head, realizing that no apology could erase what his own behavior had already revealed. The merchant remained where he stood after the brief exchange, his carefully constructed confidence unraveling with every passing second. The lively conversations that had surrounded him throughout the journey had vanished, replaced by uncomfortable silence and hesitant glances from the very people who had laughed at his carefully disguised insults. For the first time in years, his influence offered no protection. Wealth could purchase elegant clothing, generous headlines in local newspapers, and invitations to prestigious dinners, but it could not erase the memory of how he had treated a stranger whom he believed incapable of answering back. The platform, once filled with admiration for his wit, now reflected only quiet disappointment. General Alaric did not summon guards, nor did he publicly rebuke the merchant. Instead, he simply requested a private conversation with the chairman of the county council and the regional railway commissioner, both of whom had arrived to receive him. During that brief discussion, he made no exaggerated accusations. He merely described, with remarkable precision, the conduct he had witnessed throughout the journey, and suggested that they examine several long-standing complaints regarding labor conditions inside Harrow's textile warehouses, complaints that had remained conveniently ignored because of the merchant's considerable influence. Alaric believed that justice required evidence rather than anger, and if the rumors proved false, Caedmon would have nothing to fear. If they proved true, the consequences should emerge through proper investigation rather than personal revenge. Within the following months, inspectors uncovered years of dishonest accounting, unfair wages, and contracts deliberately designed to exploit struggling craftsmen who depended upon Harrow's business. Investors quietly withdrew their support. Respected associates distanced themselves, and the reputation Caedmon had spent decades polishing began to crumble. Not because one powerful man sought his downfall, but because the truth could no longer remain hidden behind polished manners and expensive philanthropy. His punishment arrived not through humiliation, but through accountability. It was the natural consequence of choices repeated for far too long. Later that evening, after the welcoming ceremony had concluded and the station gradually returned to its usual rhythm, General Alaric invited Eirlys to join him for tea in the station's quiet reception room. A small fire crackled inside the stone fireplace, filling the room with comforting warmth and the gentle aroma of burning oak. Fine porcelain cups rested upon polished walnut tables, while rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking the railway platforms. The atmosphere stood in striking contrast to the crowded carriage where they had first met only hours earlier. "I have a proposal," Alaric began after a thoughtful silence. "Not as repayment, because genuine kindness should never become a transaction, and not as charity, because you've given me no reason to believe you need pity." He explained that the military maintained a charitable foundation supporting the widows and aging parents of soldiers who had sacrificed their health in service to the crown. Many families depended upon donated clothing throughout harsh northern winters, yet the organization constantly struggled to find artisans capable of producing durable garments with genuine care rather than haste. He believed Eirlys possessed not only the necessary skill, but the character to lead such an undertaking with integrity. For several moments she simply looked at him, overwhelmed not by the opportunity itself, but by the trust it represented. "General," she said softly, "there are far more experienced seamstresses than I." Alaric smiled. "Perhaps," he answered, "but experience teaches technique. Character teaches responsibility. I can hire skilled hands almost anywhere. Finding a heart I can trust is infinitely more difficult." Eirlys accepted the offer on one condition. Mrs. Isolde Marrow, the elderly widow who had encouraged her through years of uncertainty, would be given a place within the new workshop as well. Alaric smiled immediately. "Then your first request has already been granted," he replied. "A place built on kindness should never forget those who kept kindness alive." Tears gathered quietly in Eirlys's eyes, though she quickly brushed them away before they could fall. It was the first time in many years that someone had looked beyond her circumstances and recognized the person she had always tried to be. Back in Ashcombe, people often spoke about the extraordinary journey that had begun aboard a simple railway carriage. Yet the story changed a little each time it was told. Some remembered the famous general. Others remembered the wealthy merchant who lost everything. But those who truly understood the story always began in exactly the same place, with a young seamstress who quietly shared half a loaf of bread with a stranger. The workshop that had once struggled to survive had become the headquarters of a growing charitable tailoring house, employing widows, elderly craftsmen, and young apprentices who otherwise would have found few opportunities to rebuild their lives. Every garment leaving its doors carried the same careful attention Eirlys had practiced since childhood. Inside the spacious workroom, sunlight poured through tall windows onto rows of sewing tables, where laughter mingled with the steady rhythm of needles moving through cloth. The scent of fresh linen, beeswax, polished wood, and warm bread baking in the adjoining kitchen filled the building with a sense of home that no amount of wealth alone could ever create. General Alaric visited whenever official duties allowed, though never with unnecessary ceremony. He preferred arriving quietly, setting aside his gloves near the entrance, and walking among the seamstresses as they worked. To many of the younger apprentices, he was simply a dignified gentleman who listened more than he spoke. They often found it amusing that the most decorated officer in the Northern Army seemed happiest sitting beside ordinary workers, sharing tea from simple ceramic mugs while asking about their families, and admiring finished coats destined for soldiers' widows. Eirlys always welcomed him exactly as she had on the train, with the same calm smile, the same gentle respect, and never an ounce more because of the medals he wore. Looking back, Alaric often realized that the most important lesson of his distinguished career had not been learned on a battlefield, inside a government chamber, or during a royal ceremony. It had been learned aboard an ordinary railway carriage from a woman who believed that compassion should never depend upon recognition. Titles could command obedience, wealth could attract admiration, reputation could open countless doors. But none of them possessed the quiet power of genuine kindness freely offered to someone who appeared unable to return the favor. Just as the afternoon sun filled the workshop with warm golden light, one of the youngest apprentices quietly admitted she had forgotten to bring lunch. Without saying a word, Eirlys smiled, broke her own loaf of bread neatly in half, and placed one piece into the girl's hands. Standing near the doorway, General Alaric watched the scene unfold with the same quiet smile he had worn aboard the train more than a year earlier. Nothing had changed, and that was precisely what made all the difference. Because in the end, the world is not transformed by those who insist upon being seen. It is transformed by those who continue doing what is right, even when they believe no one is watching. If this story touched you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps us continue creating stories that remind us that kindness, integrity, and compassion still matter. And now we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a small act of kindness that changed your life, or the way you see other people? Share your story in the comments. We read every one of them.